In the small town of Summerfall, Ohio, the morning of August 17, 2006, began with a call about a suspicious silence. Police entered the Craven family home and stopped. Two bodies lay on the living room floor, a young man and an attractive woman with Down syndrome. Both were lifeless. Traces of semen were found on the woman's collar. Police were surprised because it was as thick as a bull. DNA testing revealed that the semen belonged to her son. What happened to this family? The Ellory family home in the Albany suburbs stood alone, a small one-story building surrounded by a field rarely occupied. 3 windows, a narrow entryway, dark curtains. Inside, everything seemed orderly, but this was only a surface piece. Over the years, a silence had accumulated in this house, a silence that held no peace, only oppression and hidden tension. His mother, Evelyn Ellory, 47, had a mild form of Down syndrome since childhood. She was well-groomed and smiling and loved neatness and the smell of fresh linen. After her husband's death, she was left with 2 children, a son, Daniel, and a daughter, Laura. Daniel, 22, was withdrawn, meticulous, and almost painfully attached to his mother. Laura, 3 years younger, was silent and distant. Her presence in the house was unnoticed, as if she lived separately. Although she was always under the same roof, the first signs of alarming changes appeared in late 2003. After her father's departure, the family seemed to lose all sense of reality. Evelyn began spending more and more time at home. She was afraid to go out alone and tried not to look people in the eye. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to come alive. He took on the role of protector, monitoring his mother's every move, making sure she didn't tire, didn't cry, or talk to the neighbors. At first glance, this seemed like concern, but gradually the boundaries blurred. Psychologists, who later analyzed the case materials, noted that a form of emotional isolation existed in this house. No one shouted, threatened, or raised a hand, but the air was thick with control. Every object had its place. Every step sounded identical. Laura's diary, found after the tragedy, contained the phrase, "I feel something growing between them that I can't name. It's not love or care. It's a shadow that doesn't disappear even during the day." From then on, everything began to change. Evelyn increasingly locked herself in her room with the curtains drawn. Daniel brought her food, helped with her clothes, and monitored her medications. At some point, he stopped going to college. His life narrowed to the confines of this house. An obsession grew within him, akin to an obsession, not a vivid one, but a viscous, quiet, sticky one. Laura witnessed her mother and brother seemingly lose touch with the outside world. Sometimes she would wake up in the night and hear Daniel walking down the hallway, opening doors, lingering outside her mother's room. No sounds except footsteps, sometimes a quiet whisper, as if he were talking to himself. Evelyn gradually stopped talking to her daughter. If she used to ask how she was doing, now she simply walked past, her expression blank. Laura noticed her mother began avoiding mirrors and photographs, as if she didn't want to see her former self. By the spring of 2004, there were almost no voices in the house. The television was turned off, the radio was gathering dust on the shelf. Daniel stopped letting visitors in, explaining that his mother wasn't feeling well. The postman recalled that the boy always stood at the threshold, blocking the entrance. Laura lived as if in the shadows, cooking, cleaning, sleeping in snatches. In the evenings, she heard someone quietly crying behind the wall. Everything seemed to slow down. Even time flowed differently. Neither of them realized how far they had come. Evelyn had lost the ability to resist. Daniel, the ability to distinguish between care and power. Laura, the ability to hope that one of them would return to reality. Ellory's house ceased to be a home. It became a vessel where anxiety accumulated, like steam under a lid. And the deeper the silence, the more it felt like a process of destruction had already begun within, one that was bound to explode. Since the early summer of 2004, the atmosphere in Ellory's house has changed completely. The air inside seemed deprived of oxygen. It became difficult to breathe, even with the windows wide open. Things hadn't moved. The furniture hadn't moved. Yet everything around reminded her that life had stood still. Every day followed the same pattern. Mornings began with Daniel's footsteps, her mother's silence, and the rustle of Laura leaving for work. The house was still during the day, and at night, there was a wary expectation, as if the walls were listening. Evelyn rarely left her bedroom. Her gaze became slow, her movements mechanical. She sat on the bed for long periods, clutching a pillow to her chest, as if protecting herself from something invisible. Daniel didn't allow anyone into the room, citing concern, but his concern increasingly took on a possessive quality. He watched his mother's every gesture, the way she held her cup, how she sat, how she closed her eyes. Every little detail became a source of internal tension. Psychiatrists later identified this as a form of regressive control, in which a person is unaware that, under the guise of guardianship, they are substituting their own identity for another's. A different hierarchy was forming in the home, not kinship, but dependence. Evelyn increasingly submitted to her son, not out of trust, but out of fear. He became the center around which her existence revolved. Laura felt something dark growing in the house. Her mother no longer saw her as a daughter, as if the bond between the women had been severed. Every evening, Laura heard sounds through the wall, not loud, not unambiguous. Sometimes it was breathing, drawn out and ragged, sometimes the strange rattling of furniture. She didn't try to explain what was happening, but she understood that her brother had lost sight of the boundaries between his role as a son and what was permitted. Evelyn had changed physically. Her gait had become slow, her gaze vacant. Her face, once soft, now seemed as rigid as wax. Laura noticed her mother often hiding her hands, avoiding the light. It felt as if something had broken inside her, and this fracture was now visible only to her daughter. Daniel spent all his time with his mother. He didn't work, didn't study, and didn't go outside. His routine was completely synchronized with hers. He got up when she got up, went to bed when she went to bed. Gradually, the division between their spaces disappeared. There was no longer her room and his room in the house. Everything became shared. The air, the smell, the habits, even the silence. Psychosexual pressure, as experts determined, developed in this vicious cycle of dependence. The son began to perceive his mother as the center of his identity. He didn't see her as a woman in the social sense, but his body and psyche began to react to her presence, to her closeness, to her prohibition. This was an unconscious confusion of roles, where the boundaries between care, control, and instinct disappeared. Laura felt the effects of this invisible tension. With each passing day, the atmosphere in the house grew thick and unsettling. Objects seemed to absorb this energy. The sheets on the bed, the curtains that were always closed, even the air in the hallway. She increasingly found herself thinking the house was infested with something impossible to cleanse. In photographs found later, a change could be seen. Mother and son stood close, but there was no distance between them at all. Their bodies touched, their postures were identical, their gazes focused on one point. Evelyn's face showed a slowed calm, Daniel's a look of concentration. Investigators later said that these photographs revealed not just a violation of norms, but a complete breakdown of psychological barriers. Different rules operated in the home. They applied not only to behavior, but also to perception. The son could no longer distinguish between dependence and attachment, and the mother had lost the concept of personal space. By the end of the summer of 2004, the isolation had become absolute. The doors were locked, the phone disconnected. The neighbors had long since stopped seeing Evelyn outside. Laura began sleeping in the basement, where it was cool and quiet, and where at least she could block out the sounds from above. Her diary for August contained short sentences, devoid of description and emotion. They live in a different time. He looks at her as if she belongs to him, and she doesn't resist. No one knew that at that moment, the house had ceased to be a living space. It had become a kind of cage where shame dissolved and human roles were irrevocably entangled. The mental strain became unbearable. Laura could no longer remain within these walls, but leaving would mean leaving her mother alone with something she didn't understand. By autumn, the house was completely dark, physically and emotionally. No one opened the doors, no lights were turned on. The neighbors saw only a dim flicker in the window, the only evidence that anyone was still breathing inside. That breathing became the last sound of life in Ellory's house. Everything else became a waiting catastrophe that no one could stop. In the fall of 2004, Ellory's house no longer resembled the place where the family had once lived. Everything inside obeyed a strange rhythm, devoid of time. Day and night were no longer distinct, as if the sun and moon no longer held power over these walls. Evelyn stopped opening the windows. The light irritated her, as if reminding her that life existed beyond the house. Daniel, on the other hand, felt increasingly confident. His body and demeanor changed. His movements acquired a commanding, almost animalistic quality. With each passing day, control became not just a habit, but a necessity. He couldn't be away from his mother, even for a few minutes. Her every movement aroused in him an anxiety that resembled jealousy. She didn't speak, didn't ask, but her silence only deepened his dependence. He watched her not out of fear for her safety, but out of a sense of inner necessity. Her presence became an anchor without which he lost his sense of existence. Laura, an outside observer, began to see something almost ritualistic in this. She noticed that her mother and brother moved around the house in the same way, as if mirroring each other. They ate at the same time, breathed in unison, and climbed the stairs with the same step. Even their posture became similar. This merging didn't seem like love or care, more like a gradual loss of boundaries between two bodies, united by a common anxiety. Psychiatrists, who later analyzed this condition, called it a parasitic, symbiotic relationship. In it, one person overwhelms the other, not through violence, but through constant emotional intrusion. This creates an illusion of unity, where dependence becomes a substitute for love. In Ellory's home, this dependence took on physical manifestations. Daniel began to touch his mother obsessively, not as a son, but as someone checking to see if the object still belonged to him. These touches conveyed not passion, but control. Evelyn didn't resist. Her body became part of his routine. She moved when he allowed it and froze when he stopped. At some point, she stopped perceiving herself as a woman, a mother, or a human being. She became an extension of someone else's desire, wordless and willless. This wasn't a sexual act, but the destruction of one's identity under the pressure of someone else's will. Laura saw the consequences. Her mother began avoiding mirrors, tearing photographs off the walls, as if afraid to see her former self. Plates disappeared from the kitchen. They ate from the same bowl. Evelyn and Daniel's clothes lay in the same closet, undivided. Space and objects lost their individuality. There was no longer a hers and his in the house. Everything became a shared body. The psychosexual pressure manifested itself in rituals. Every morning, Daniel would run his hand through his mother's hair, as if checking to see if she was there. In the evening, he would sit by her bed, not leaving until she fell asleep. He didn't realize that these actions were becoming a substitute for physical intimacy, in which the boundaries of generations disappeared. In his mind, the role of a son dissolved into the need to possess. For Evelyn, everything that was happening was an inner darkness. She felt neither desire nor fear, only resignation. Her thoughts lost their structure, and time became a chain of repetitive gestures. Laura found strange notes in her room, written in illegible handwriting. "I am him. He knows when I breathe. I can't be alone." These phrases became a direct reflection of her mental disintegration. During those months, Daniel began to lose control of himself. He stopped washing, didn't shave, and his clothes felt alien. His body seemed to be in a constant state of tension. He spent hours sitting on the floor next to his mother's bed, staring into space. His gaze was emotionless, only fixed expectation. The distinction between love, obsession, and power disappeared. Experts later noted that by this point, a role confusion had occurred. The mother was no longer the object of protection, and the son had lost his inner control. This state leads to one person becoming a mirror of the other, reflecting not their personality, but their inner distortion. The atmosphere in the home was one of tension, every touch arousing anxiety. Laura no longer slept at night. She felt that the isolation was no longer simply physical. The house had become a body where the painful process of two people merging was taking place. The smell, the sounds, the rhythm of her breathing, all of it was created by an unconscious psychosexual field in which she felt like an alien element. By December 2004, mother and son were barely speaking anymore, but the bond between them was growing stronger. The lack of words made the atmosphere even denser. Their behavior resembled a hypnotic state when a person's consciousness is supplanted by instinct. Evelyn no longer showed signs of her own will. Her movements became slow, her eyes glassy. By that point, Ellory's home had become a closed system. Everything that happened within was the result of one thing: the loss of boundaries between maternal affection and obsessive control. It wasn't incest in the literal sense. It was a form of psychological decomposition in which the son perceived his mother as his sole extension. Laura realized the process had become irreversible. The house lived by laws that defied explanation. Each day dragged on like a single unbroken moment, where breath and anxiety intertwined. And in this stillness, a feeling arose as if everything living in the house had already died, leaving only bodies bound together by by a single, silent dependence. In the winter of 2005, Ellory's house reached a point that experts would later call the point of no return. All life there existed only by inertia. The air became thick and heavy, as if saturated with something invisible. Furniture, walls, floors, everything absorbed the scent of stagnant fear. It seemed the house itself no longer served as a refuge, but was turning into a shell for those unable to leave. Daniel completely lost touch with the outside world. He stopped answering calls, ignored knocks at the door, and didn't open the curtains. His internal rhythm became dependent on his mother's breathing. Her every breath and movement became signals for him, commands to action. He ate when she ate, slept when she closed her eyes. It wasn't a unity, but a parasitic symmetry in which the concept of individuality disappeared. Evelyn no longer spoke at all. Her body slowly weakened. Her skin became translucent. Her movements sluggish. Sometimes she would simply sit for hours on the floor, her head bowed, as if trying to hear something within herself. She no longer perceived Daniel as a son, but rather as a force controlling her existence. There was no longer any will in the house, only mechanical dependence. Laura watched this process with a sense of detached horror. She no longer tried to intervene. Everything inside her had broken. She knew no one would come. Any appeal for help would have meant admitting what was happening. So she remained silent, living among the shadows that had once been called family. In January, the problems began. Daniel began to lose control of his behavior. His body trembled. His breathing became labored. He would stand against the wall for hours, staring at his mother without blinking. Sometimes he would fall to his knees before her, not out of pleading, but out of inner exhaustion. His mind was completely torn between filial dependence and the need to dominate. Evelyn didn't react. She simply sat there swaying, her lips barely moving. There was no fear in her gaze, only a complete lack of life. From that moment on, events began to unfold rapidly. Laura would later say that the night before the tragedy, the house was dead. No footsteps, no sounds, only silence and the faint flickering of light from her mother's room. She stood in the hallway and felt the cold coming from it. When she walked inside in the morning, it was all over. The scene the investigators encountered resembled not a crime, but the final act of prolonged self-destruction. Two bodies lay on the floor, a woman and a young man, lying almost touching, like reflections. Nearby lay an overturned lamp and a broken mirror. The pathologist's report indicated that death occurred almost simultaneously. There were no signs of a struggle. It looked like a shared departure, in which fear gave way to fusion. Laura was left alone in the silence, the last witness to how love turned into dependence and care into destruction. Ellory's house was soon sold, but neighbors long later reported hearing faint echoes of footsteps from inside at night, as if someone were still repeating the same rhythm that Daniel had lived. The investigation into the tragedy at Ellory's house lasted several months. Investigators were faced with a case lacking the usual hallmarks of a crime. No struggle, no external violence. Everything pointed to a prolonged internal process of destruction. A forensic examination determined that Daniel and Evelyn died almost simultaneously from cardiac arrest brought on by severe nervous and physical exhaustion. No traces of toxins, drugs, or weapons were found. The room where the death occurred resembled not a murder scene, but an inner symbol of their connection. Old family photographs hung on the walls, many torn in half. One showed 3 smiling people, photographed against the backdrop of a river. On the back, someone had scrawled in a shaky hand, "Now we are one." Analysis suggests the inscription was written by Daniel just days before his death. Psychiatrists called this case a classic example of symbiotic collapse. This is a rare phenomenon in which the boundaries between the addict and the object of their addiction disappear completely. In such cases, one participant completely loses their identity, while the other strives for physical and emotional fusion. Such stories often end tragically, either in murder or simultaneous suicide. Laura Ellory testified 2 months after the funeral. Her speech was slow and fragmented. She spoke of invisible pressure, of a silence that breathed, of looks that made you want to disappear. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She was placed under observation and soon left the state. Laura's whereabouts in the following years are unknown. The house on Pine Ridge Street stood empty for nearly 5 years. It couldn't sell. Potential buyers backed out after the first viewing. There was a chill inside that even property experts couldn't explain. In 2010, the building was demolished. A new house was built in its place. but the land registry still lists the original address, 1412 Pine Ridge. Albany County Police classified the case as a shared death under undetermined circumstances. The reports make no mention of violence, but between the lines, a story of dependency pushed to the limit is revealed. Psychologists who reviewed the materials emphasize that such cases rarely go public. They develop within closed families, where care gradually turns into control, and control into a distortion of the very essence of human connection. The court records were sealed, and the case was archived under file number 45-2005, Ellory. At the end of the report, the investigator noted a short phrase: "No signs of outside interference, only 2 people lost in their own silence." This entry became the last official line in the Ellory family's history. After it, there were no comments, publications, or mentions. The case vanished from the news, just like the house, quietly, without a trace. Today, a new building with a well-kept garden and white shutters stands on the site of the former plot. To the casual passerby, it's an ordinary place, but the county archives still hold the coroner's report, which states in one line, "Cause of death, emotionally induced collapse under isolation conditions." This phrase became the final word in a case that experts called neither murder nor suicide, but a rare form of disappearance. The disappearance not of bodies, but of individuals vanishing into the presence of others.